Well, it's a great privilege now to continue our talk, our series of talks on divine action by introducing Dr. Nicholas Saunders. Nicholas read natural sciences and theology here in this university in Cambridge, and then did a PhD also here on physics and theology. He is an associate of Dr. Fraser Watt's group at the Divinity Faculty, working on science and religion issues, and also the Ian Ramsey Centre in Oxford. He has won several international prizes for his work in science and religion, particularly the biennial prize of the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology, and a John Templeton Foundation Exemplary Published Papers Prize. His particular expertise is on this very topic of divine action, and he's written this excellent book, which we've got on our bookstall, which I think pretty much critiques all the views that are around. So it'll be very interesting to hear what Nicholas has to say. Thank you.
The methods of divine wisdom are infinite and unsearchable, and we must not expect fully to comprehend all the secrets and mysteries of God's government, but something we may know of this, enough to teach us to reverence God and to trust in him, and to vindicate his providence from the cavils of ignorance and infidelity, which is as much as it is as useful for us to know. William Sherlock wrote those words in 1694 when he was the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. But there's a lot to be said to commend them some 320 years later. There are, of course, limits to what we can know about the nature of divine action as human beings. We have a very limited perspective on God's transcendence. We know very little about science in the grand scheme of things. But we shouldn't, and we can never hope to properly comprehend the secrets and mysteries as Sherlock described them. But that shouldn't push us in the opposite direction of just asserting that God's transcendent nature means that we can never talk meaningfully about divine action at all. What we have to do is try and bring our knowledge of the sciences to our knowledge from our theological knowledge, and use them as Arthur Peacock's put it, as an inference to the best explanation for where we are and for the nature of the universe. There are times, obviously, I'll begin by saying I've got a couple of confessions. The first of those is that I don't believe in a radical distinction between scientific knowledge and theological knowledge on the other hand. There are obviously very fundamental differences between science and theology. I mean, for example, there's no such thing as a theological experiment, and the nature of scientific inquiries is a very different inquiry to the way that theology proceeds. There's no revelation in science. But that said, and of course they address different levels of explanation in the world as well. But they both are describing or attempting to describe the same reality. And that's why there must be a consonance between the two. And that's why, to a certain extent, I think that science should influence theology in the same way that theology, to a certain extent, should be able to influence science. And some of the areas in which theology really can influence science are on the more metaphysical aspects of science, such as the approach to the quantum measurement problem. And one of the things that I'll come on to later on is whether actually we can use theology as a bit of a guide to sift between the different conflicting approaches to quantum measurement. So science and theology are by no means methodologically identical. They address different levels of explanation. They address different questions. That said, I think it's important that theologians, and philosophical theologians in particular, adopt some of the methodology of science and also acknowledge quite openly that there is such a thing as a theological model. The scientists are used to this way of thinking. Obviously when Newton proposed one set of the laws of motion, Einstein came along and showed that they were an approximation to a much more comprehensive model. Philosophers of science are very used to the idea of models being replaced. For Popper, it's an iterative process where we go from conjecture, refutation, and we eventually get to a scientific truth. For Thomas Kuhn, it's rather more to do with who actually went to which conference, who paid for what bit of research, and who went for a drink in which bar with who. Either way, science progresses, and most philosophers of science will agree that there is the models are replaced. Whether we get towards an ultimate truth or not in science is where they differ fundamentally. Theologians don't obviously have the benefit of experiments with which to test their models, but there is, I do feel to a certain extent, there is a general feeling amongst philosophical theology that there's a need to get the models right first time. And this is something that I strongly feel isn't easily sustainable in a thoroughgoing dialogue with science. Science changes, our understanding of theology should change as well. And we shouldn't be afraid of the simple fact that as scientific understanding develops, so too will our theological understanding of the world. That said, there are things in theology, there are certain aspects of theology that are more fundamental, that are more fundamental tenets than perhaps there are in science. But that said, we shouldn't be afraid of looking at divine action and the different approaches to divine action with a critical eye. And we shouldn't be concerned when one model is potentially replaced by another model, or you assess the different benefits of the different models side by side. It is all, in my view, a step of getting closer to God's creation, understanding the nature of the creation and our very limited position within that creation. As Thomas Kuhn said when he was looking at the development of science through models changing, there are a series of factors which, extraneous factors that actually lead to one model becoming more readily adopted than others. The same is true within theology and science to a certain extent. In sunny California, quantum approaches to divine action are extremely popular. There are a group of people who are very keen on these indeed. In generally cold Cambridge, obviously not today, but generally cold Cambridge, where the wind blows off the Urals, there is no particular fondness for quantum approaches to divine action, and that's as much a reflection on the individuals and the personalities involved as the relative merits of the different models. But again, when looked at as models, then there are things to be learned from each approach, and as philosophical theologians, we shouldn't be worried too much about one model being replaced by another. Now I'm going to turn to the thesis of my talk, called it A Quest for Indeterminacy. This is, to a certain extent, what the attempts to associate divine action and science have become. The areas of science that are most attractive to theologians are exactly those areas where there is an indeterminacy, where there's enough loose play between the otherwise deterministic laws of nature for a potential exploitation or a potential determination of the future of the universe to be made by God. What I'd like to demonstrate that is that in relation to the quantum approaches to divine action in particular, there's a certain philosophical sleight of hand going on. Essentially, they're adopting one particular approach to the laws of nature, and then one particular approach to the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, and using them in a particular way to get to a supposedly coherent view of divine action. And there are some fundamental questions about whether the steps on that logical process are actually correct or not. Before I get on to that, let's look just fundamentally at why we're talking about divine action in the first place. There are broadly three different types of factors as to why people would assert that God acts in the world. And in this talk, I'll speak very much from a Christian perspective, which is my own background. The first of those is a scriptural approach, and John talked about this a little bit this morning. The Bible talks clearly about a series of great events. They are highly significant because they are signs, to use that language. The world is wholly subordinate in respect of God's power. But we need to be very careful because, in particular in relation to some of the, as it were, the great miracles in the Old Testament, the approach in which the way that those were written and the approach that the authors of those books had to nature was wholly different to the worldview that we bring to it now. And it's very easy to make jumps from reading a literal text to assume that God is therefore tweaking the world, is therefore involved in parting the Red Sea, and that was done through a process of altering the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules and so on. That kind of analysis isn't faithful to the text, and it isn't faithful to the purpose of those texts. And I'm not denying that miracles ever took place, and like John, I strongly feel that the resurrection is a genuine event. But there is. You have to look carefully and understand exactly where the biblical authors were coming from when they wrote those approaches. Let's take, for example, the parting of the Red Sea, which is described in Exodus. There are two different accounts in the book of Exodus of the parting of the Red Sea. In chapter 14, verse 21, there's talk about the God driving the seas back with an enormous easterly wind. So the wind blows the sea apart, essentially. In chapter 15, verse 8, we're told that the waters were made to stand up and that the seas congealed into a mass. And the first explanation is effectively God, as it were, hijacking the wind to blow the sea apart. The second one is where God actually fundamentally transforms the very nature of water. He, to put a modern spin on it, changes the way that the water molecules are bonded together. He strengthens the hydrogen bonds or whatever, and creates a substance which doesn't behave in the way that we expect water to behave. The passage is, in context, is a description of God's victory over the forces of chaos. It was remarkable because it's not remarkable fundamentally because God suspends the laws of nature, although that's the way that we would naturally read it now. It's remarkable because God's power is so absolute. Yahweh's power, a couple of verses later, is compared with the Egyptians' storm gods and is held to be enormously superior. And this is the fundamental distinction between some of the biblical approaches to nature and the modern day scientific approach that we all carry around with us just by virtue of being born when we were. As Henry Frankfurt has put it, in those times, as it were, the biblical times, the natural world was not an it was a thou. There's no Hebrew term that naturally maps onto the modern concept of nature. And our perspective changes largely because whenever we think about the modern world, we think about the world in terms of a set of autonomous natural laws. There is a certain autonomy to the laws of nature. There's a regularity, there's a predictability, and it may well be that the laws of the stuff that the universe is made from is connected together in a certain predictable and deterministic way, and we'll come on to this in a minute. The second thing that's really changed our perspective is the development of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. We look at the universe in a very different way as a result of those two limbs, the scientific one and this idea of the universe being sustained entirely in being by God. There are obviously other motivations. John talked about intercessionary prayer. There's also some philosophical arguments about coherence of a created world and so on. So what is divine action about? GDA and SDA at the top of the slide are abbreviations for general divine action and special divine action. And these are really the two varieties, as it were, that most philosophers approach divine action from. Although they don't quite agree on how you make a distinction, most people do agree that there are two fundamentally different types of action in play. Owen Thomas has rather helpfully produced a taxonomy of questions that you could ask about divine action. And he draws 5 different types of question out. First of all, he says there's a question about essentially a mechanical question. By what means could divine action actually occur? Is it a quantum manipulation? Is it the input of pure energy, pure information, sorry, rather than pure energy? So the input of pure information. Secondly, what's the relationship between divine causation and finite causation? Are they complementary or are they mutually exclusive? Or can the two exist in tandem together? The third question that Thomas identifies is, well, how often does divine action take place? Is it something that takes place in every single event? Is it rather a sort of Calvinistic conception of God's hand at work in every single event in the universe? Or is it something that's only fitful, or does it not really take place at all? And there are different possibilities there. The next 2 questions are really rather more metaphysical and therefore even more difficult, as it were, for us to approach. What's the effect of divine action? Both sort of locally, does it heal a disease or inspire an individual to act in a certain way, and do we get to glimpse God's purpose for the universe? And then ultimately, what's the purpose of God's what's the purpose of the actions having been caused in the first place? That's the 5th question. Essentially, is there is it to promote ends of divine justice or peace or whatever? Now, obviously, those last 2 questions are, as I say, even more difficult because you're required to know far more about the actual nature of God than you are than we could ever know from science or theology put together. The 2 different types of divine action are the basis on which there are 2 different bases on which to distinguish them. General divine action, I prefer to look at as being the actions of God that pertain to the whole of creation simultaneously. So it's, for example, the initial creation itself, the maintenance of the universe in its being. So we've got, for example, the maintenance of scientific regularity. The laws of nature are an expression of general divine action. The fact that God acts and is not a capricious conjurer, as John puts it, is because of general divine action and the fact that God acts rationally and coherently. Special divine action I prefer to approach on the basis of God acting in a particular time and at a particular place. So unlike general divine action, where it's just effectively the hands that hold the universe in being, special divine action is generally conceived of as being an opportunity for God to perform certain actions at certain times in certain places. The other basis on which to create the distinction is to talk about the nature of the action. And this is something which Michael Langford has done. And he basically says that the reason that that special divine action is really analogous to a human decision, and it's intimately bound up with this notion of God being a personal being, but personal, taking personal action in creation, and it's that character that makes it special, and that's as a basis between special divine action and general divine action. That's one way of categorizing it, but it isn't an easy fit with what we know from science, and that's the reason that I prefer talking about the actions taking place at particular times in particular places. There are effectively these 2 different types of action that could occur. Relativity is, of course, the big difficulty for talking about anything which talking about particular times and particular places, and as Einstein said, it depends fundamentally on your frame of reference and so on, and simultaneity is not an absolute concept. But with acknowledging that difficulty, I find it much more it's a much more fundamental physical, as it were, distinction between general and special divine action. Now, it's arguable that there's actually a crossover between general divine action and special divine action. Some theologians have talked about whether it's possible to envisage a situation where the sustaining in being creates local effects. And one of the analogies, and this is a very limited analogy, is if you imagine a steel bar being bent by some enormous hands, the bar will fail at a certain point. It will rupture at a certain point, and that creates, as it were, a local event, even though the pressure is applied to the bar, or can be applied to the bar uniformly. And although talking about creation and God's action in terms of, as it were, a sort of failure point in the universe is a very limited way of thinking about it, there is an argument that similar, general divine action, similarly sustaining actions on the whole of creation, could have local events as well. And this is also a fundamental difficulty with making this distinction. There have been a lot of attempts to subsume special divine action into general divine action. Austin Farrer was one person who was has been labelled to a certain extent with having attempted that. And Maurice Wiles has also been criticised in that way as well. It actually led to Brian Hebblethwaite, when he reviewed a book by Maurice Wiles which was called God's Action in the World. Brian's title for the review was God's Inaction in the World. And the difficulty is that on Wiles's approach, it's very difficult to reconcile with this idea of a God acting in a specific way at specific times. What Wiles says is that playing an active role in the world may not be an appropriate description of the God whose agency I've been seeking to describe, but that God is no dead God. He's the living God, the source of all life, and the source of the authentic life which his worshippers seek to realise in the grateful awareness of an all-pervasive and sustaining presence. So, although Wiles doesn't propose a position where God actually does something on a local level, as it were, he does essentially acknowledge that God acts in the world in a way which Hebblethwaite, and I have to admit, I find fairly unsatisfactory. There are also attempts to subsume general divine action into special divine action, which is effectively the flip side of the coin. So there we've got ideas where God acts in every single event. God determines every single quantum indeterminacy. God is active in the fall of every sparrow, and so on. And these two perspectives, these fundamental distinctions which have existed in theology for some time, play right through into the different approaches that have been adopted to quantum divine action and the general attempts to fit science to theology. I'm going to talk a little bit about miracles. We owe an awful lot to David Hume for our common perception of what actually a miracle is. This idea of it being a violation of natural law. Although I think it's worth actually taking a step back and say, well, what are you talking about when you're saying a violation of a natural law? What do you mean by a natural law? One of the points which I think it was one of the points which was made about David Hume's work is effectively by David Hume defining natural law in the way that he defined it, there never could be anything other than a violation of a natural law. So he'd already answered the question, what is a miracle, by defining laws in the way that he did. Now, as with any task where you set philosophers running on it, there are probably 1,000 different approaches to the laws of nature. You'd be relieved to know that I've tried to categorise them just into 3 different broad approaches here. The first of those is what's called the regularity approach to the laws of nature. The regularity approach is one in which the laws of nature are secondary to the events that take place in the universe. So events are primary, and the laws of nature describe what events have taken place. Norman Schwartz has said that the the mere possibility, the bare logical possibility of God performing a miracle is totally inconsistent with a regularity approach to laws. And the reason that that's the case is because all the laws of nature do in a regularity approach is describe the events that have happened in the universe. The laws are ontologically secondary to what has taken place. So if God is acting in a local way, if God is performing special divine actions in the world, those will be encompassed within the laws as they eventually form. So essentially there is nothing in a regularity approach that could ever be a violation of a law of nature, because the laws actually are derived from the events, they're derived from the divine actions that have already taken place. There are various philosophical tricks that regularitarians, as it were, use to try and sidestep the issue of the fact that it's actually very difficult to make any prediction about anything using a regularity approach to laws. I mean, I actually find it, can't really ever conceive of being adopting that philosophical approach, because it effectively gets you into a state where your laws of nature aren't really describing anything about the ontology of the world. They're describing, effectively, they are entirely dependent on the epistemology that you're using to try and describe. The second approach is an instrumentalist approach. Instrumentalist approaches are, perhaps, if anything, even more despairing than regularity approaches to the laws of nature. Essentially, the laws on an instrumentalist approach are descriptions that rational minds impose on external events. So laws don't determine, in any sense, what actually happens in the universe. It's simply our attempt to try and make sense out of what's out there. Now, you know, the fact that we may go off and discover a law, in inverted commas, may make us happy. We feel we've got a certain intellectual coherence out of doing it, but it doesn't mean that we found anything fundamental about the way that the universe is constructed. We haven't actually described the ontology of the universe, how the universe really is. They are entirely, as it were, mental or rational minds forming a coherent explanation. Now, obviously, the laws of nature do, to a certain extent, delimit what we, or understanding of the laws of nature delimits what we would expect to see in a situation and what we wouldn't. But again, it's not possible on an instrumentalist approach for there to be a violation miracle, because nothing has been violated other than our own limited understanding of how the universe operates. And it's our intellectual coherence that's been broken, rather than a fundamental law of nature that determines the way that the universe operates. The final, as it were, school of thought is what's known as a necessitarian approach to laws of nature. Necessitarian accounts rely on the fact that there is something in the nature of one entity, of A-ness, that makes it relate with B-ness in such a way that there is an inexorable, there is an ontological connection between the two. It is the only approach to the laws of nature where violation miracles are possible, because the laws of nature are ontologically prior to the events that happen. The laws determine what happens. And effectively, the universe follows a set of laws that are ordained out there. Now, we obviously don't know all of the different laws, but it's not that they don't not exist because we haven't found them. They are there, and they're in the nature of the different entities that make up the universe, and it's something to do with the way that they're connected. Is what makes the universe tick along in a particularly, or potentially rather clockwork way. It's just that we don't actually understand all of the different laws of nature. Now, the necessitarian approach is one where violation miracles are obviously possible, because what you're doing is, effectively, you're saying that the different entities within the universe ontologically themselves determine the way that the universe will develop in time, as time progresses. And if God, as it were, zaps in and changes that fundamental relation, then he has violated an ethereal law of nature. And that's not quite the approach that Hume himself took, because that was really more of a sort of evidentially based approach, but the modern philosophical approach, the modern philosophical account in the necessitarian laws is one in which divine action is very difficult to reconcile with science unless we have indeterminacy. And that's where indeterminacy kicks in. So, why is it that indeterminism is so attractive? The basic argument runs a little bit like this. First presupposition is that God creates the universe. The second thing that you have to bring to is you have to say that your account of the laws of nature is a necessitarian one, that there is an ontological aspect to the universe that determines the way that entities fit together and that predicts their progress. You then ask the question, well, if that's the case, where is there any flexibility? Where is there any area where God could act without overruling those laws? And it's precisely in an assertion that the universe is indeterministic that you can have that play, that interplay, that flexibility. I think one of the best descriptions of determinism and indeterminism was given by William James in a 1884 address that he gave, which obviously this science has moved on a little bit, but the approach, the way that he describes it, I think is quite a good guide. What he said was, determinism professes that those parts of the universe already laid down absolutely point and decree what the other parts shall be. The future has no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb. The part we call the present is compatible with only one totality. Any other future complement than the one fixed for eternity is totally impossible. The whole is in each and every part, and welds itself with the rest into an absolute unity, an iron block in which there can be no equivocation or shadow of turning. Indeterminism, on the contrary, says that the parts have a certain amount of loose play on each other, so that the laying down of one of them does not necessarily determine what the others shall be. And it's that loose play that's very theologically attractive for precisely this reason. So, the question is, if science teaches us, and there are certain philosophical interpretations of quantum mechanics that say that quantum mechanics is fundamentally statistical, it is indeterminate in that sense, then is it possible for God to step in and determine an otherwise indeterminate event in order to achieve an action in the world? And that's effectively an idea of God cheating at playing dice. Einstein said that God plays dice, or didn't like the idea of God playing dice in quantum mechanics. Theological attempts to fit the two together is effectively where God is playing dice with one hand, but then is also breaking the rules with the other. Now, the great benefit, this is speaking rather cynically, the great benefit from theologians' perspective is that although you can never prove that God acts in this particular way, you can never prove that he doesn't. And the reason for this is something Hempel rather sort of grandiosely called the problem of epistemic ambiguity. Essentially, you don't know, if you've got probabilistic laws in play, which probabilistic law is the active law that's determining that particular event. And in the same way that if quantum mechanics is probabilistic, how do you actually know that it isn't God determining something or just chance? There is no way of telling it apart. And that's a fundamental problem with irreducibly probabilistic laws of nature. It's something that Nancy Cartwright has produced quite an interesting analogy. She said, well, let's take the example of smoking. Smoking causes lung cancer, and this is a well-trodden probabilistic law. But let's imagine that people who smoke also have a predilection to exercise more than normal members of the public. So the question is, are the people who die from smoking actually killed by the smoking? It may well be that actually their predilection for additional exercise overweighs the causal effect of the lung cancer, and because at the end of the day you can't tell what killed that particular individual, there is no way epistemologically of actually ascribing a cause to that particular event. And that is again, one of the theological benefits, as it were, of approaching divine action from indeterminacy, or looking at indeterministic events. Essentially, there is no way, theoretically, in which you could prove that it wasn't God, up to a point. Now, just to recap, we're forced down into this discussion about indeterminism because we've taken an approach to the laws of nature that's necessitarian, that there is a determinacy, and it's an ontological determinacy in the way that the bits of the universe actually fit together. So we wouldn't have to do this were we talking about a probabilistic set of law, not probabilistic, a regularitarian approach. So this is effectively a subset of decisions, metaphysical decisions, that we've already made earlier on about what the laws of nature actually are. The second fundamental question is, if God sustains the universe in being, what exactly is an indeterministic process? And if something is indeterministic, what does it actually mean to say that God determines an indeterministic process? David Bartholomew is one of the very few people to really try to grapple with this problem. And what he said is, I find it impossible to frame any statement about God's action in generating random events which avoids the notion of design on his part, and so justifies us in saying that chance events are without any explanation whatsoever. To allow the existence of pure chance, ontological indeterminism, is rather like saying that God can choose to act so that his left hand doesn't know what his right hand is doing. Or to put it more formally, there must be sources of independent action within the one Godhead. So if God is sustaining a genuinely independent, indeterministic process, and then choosing at certain times to step in, then with one hand God is, as it were, performing a kenotic act. He's limiting his knowledge about a particular physical system, and then taking that over again at other times when he wants to perform certain divine actions. And that creates some quite interesting philosophical difficulties for exactly how, what does this mean for our notion of God? And what does this mean for indeterminacy? Is indeterminacy really, is there such a thing as actual indeterminacy in a universe where the indeterminacy itself is sustained by God in its being? So, turn quickly to quantum mechanics. There have been lots of attempts to relate quantum theory to special divine action, and mainly those are motivated by the Copenhagen approach to quantum measurement. The key point about quantum mechanics is that quantum mechanics, up to the point of measurement, is a wholly deterministic system. There is nothing unusual about quantum mechanics, apart from when the measurement actually takes place, because you effectively at that point, one particular state is selected from a superposition of other different states. And so it's that magical moment of measurement that is the key to approaches to quantum special divine action. Now, there are different philosophical approaches to, or different metaphysical accounts of what quantum measurement is about. There's the Copenhagen school of thought, which says there is a fundamentally indeterministic process. We can never get behind the statistical law of quantum mechanics. There are also the many worlds and many minds type processes where the entire universe is conjectured to split in half at the time of measurement. One of the interesting areas where I think theology might have a hand in as it were, assisting science is actually to look at, well, what are the theological implications of, for example, the many worlds approach to quantum mechanics. In a way, if the universe does split, and it's a slightly difficult step to talk about morality in this case, but you are talking about there being totally good and totally evil universes, all sustained by God. And sometimes it's those sort of consequences that could actually one of the few sort of occasions where theology can actually have a hand in trying to talk about, well, what is actually an appropriate metaphysical account of quantum mechanics. quantum special divine action relies, as I said, on the account of quantum mechanical measurement, in which there is indeterminism. And the way that that account works is it's essentially a regularitarian account. So because it's an indeterminate event, the laws of nature only describe the statistical results of the system, rather than actually determining what the result will be in each particular account. But the question is that there is a certain amount of philosophical sleight of hand going on, because if you recall, the reason we've actually got into this debate in the first place was because we've been forced into a discussion about indeterminism, and had we been regularitarians the whole way through, we never would have needed quantum mechanics in the first place. Because actually, if the laws of nature don't prescribe what happens, they only describe what happens, then there's no need to actually look at quantum mechanics. God could just act in any way possible, and none of the laws are ever violated. And that's the fundamental sleight of hand that goes on behind many of these accounts of quantum special divine action. So the question is, what's the point of bothering with quantum mechanics? Is there actually any reason that you're forced into a quantum mechanical account? And that's one of the reasons why I'm not a particular fan of the attempts to reconcile quantum mechanics and divine action. The other approach is chaos theory based special divine action, which is something which John has developed. Again here, it's actually worth looking back at how, as it were, chaos theory was first made popular, or first, as it were, discovered. William Lorentz, who was working as a climatologist at the time, actually just generated a very simple mathematical model of how weather systems might develop, and he produced 3 equations which he ran through a very early computer. The computer produced a large number of results which were duly printed onto perhaps punched cards, or maybe even on a dot matrix printer. Needless to say, Lorentz had run the equations once on a set of particular initial conditions and got a set of results. Several months later, Lorentz went back to those results and ran them back through the computer. And what he discovered is he got a completely different set of results out. And the reason for that was that the computer was working to a certain degree of accuracy, say 5 decimal places, whereas the printouts were only to 3 decimal places. And the two, although he thought there'd be no difference between the results because the 2 decimal places that were missed off on the printout were insignificant, it turned out that as the system developed on his equations, there was a fundamental difficulty in predicting. And that's led to what's widely called the problem of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Lorentz's original discussion used the analogy of a seagull flapping its wings, although that's turned into a rather more prosaic butterfly in subsequent discussions. Essentially, the idea is that if a butterfly flaps its wings in South America, the weather system is so intimately connected that without knowledge of the flap of those wings in South America, you will never actually be able to make a wholly accurate prediction of what the weather will be like in Cambridge. Not only has this saved the Met Office a certain amount of embarrassment, but it's actually a fundamental, it leads to 2 fundamental conclusions. Firstly, the universe in many ways is much more interconnected than might first appear. Things are much more dependent on each other. There's a certain amount of holism that comes out of this. The second thing is that without knowing those initial conditions absolutely perfectly, you can never make a wholly accurate prediction in a deterministic system. So there is nothing, these are just relying on normal standard mechanics. There's no assumption of indeterminacy here. So you have to know the initial state to a perfect degree of accuracy. Now, one of the things that could be argued is that if you look deep into a chaotic system, as the system, as the complexity gets more and more complex, the energy levels between the different states of that system get closer and closer. And eventually, in the infinite limit, you get to a point where you have an informational input only. It's not there is no energy difference between the different states. And the argument goes, well, God could act in a way by inputting pure energy, pure information, sorry, not energy. He could could input pure information and thereby cause different states to occur in the future. There is no problem with that approach if you make the metaphysical assumption about what the deterministic state of a chaotic system is. But absent that, there is a bit of a difficulty with the way in which chaotic systems actually describe the universe. Because at the end of the day, a lot of things in the world are chaotic. They can be, they fall within this description of chaos theory, but they don't. The universe doesn't embody that infinite complexity. If you take, for example, two beakers in a chemical reaction, one particular beaker will have a finite number of atoms of a particular type in it. I mean, it's going to be extremely difficult to ascertain what that is, but you don't have an infinitely complex number of atoms. There is a finite number. When that reacts with another finite number of atoms, when you mix the two beakers together, then you can have a perfectly chaotic system developing. But it isn't right to say that you have to know those initial conditions to an infinite degree of precision, because which you have to do in order to make the prediction, but the systems themselves are not infinitely complex. And so that means that chaos theory actually makes over-complexifying assumptions about the way that the universe operates. And it's those over-complexifying assumptions that are where the energy states get so close that there is only an informational input. And that's why it's quite difficult, in my view at least, although John will no doubt have something to say in reply, for there to be this informational input as a potential, as it were, mechanism of divine action. I think, well, we've got 10 minutes to go. I think it's probably easiest if we hand over there. I mean, one of the final things I'll just talk about quickly is whether another third approach, which is the whole part and, as it were, emergentist arguments for divine action. This relies on the fact that it's effectively a denial of the idea of reductionism, the doctrine of reductionism, that there are different states that emerge at different systems emerge at different levels, and because of that, there's a potential for either indeterministic systems or systems that are more flexible to accommodate divine action to emerge at different levels. And so we shouldn't be concerned that we have very low-level reductionism in physics, when actually when you look at, for example, a system as complex as the human brain, it may have enough complexity within it to actually encompass that. Emergentism is a very interesting area indeed, and it's something we can come back to in the questions. The other argument is one which Arthur Peacock has worked on to some extent. That's talking about whole part causation, and this is one where effectively the whole can cause events within parts of that entity, as it were, and that also I think is potentially a fruitful area to look at going forward. Again, it's very difficult to articulate in any detail exactly what that theory might look like, because we really are very much stepping on the toes of metaphysics. But these are areas which really are worth sort of investigating in further detail.
Quite a number of questions already, I think.
I wonder if you could clarify for someone who's not a philosopher why you moved fairly quickly to the necessitarian view of laws of nature, because I've never found that an attractive position personally as a scientist. And are you saying that there's something untenable about the various kinds of empiricist view?
No, not that there's something untenable. It's that I mean it's partly probably an expression of my own prejudice, really. I rather like to think of the universe as having something innately within it that means that certain entities are connected in certain ways, and that makes it attractive to me. There are rather more sort of philosophically adept versions of the other empiricist approaches. For example, there's a distinction in the regularitarian approach between events falling under a law of nature and events being explained by a law of nature. And there are, as I say, ways of actually creating a more subtle version of those approaches, which do avoid some of the, as we say, the most sort of fundamental difficulties, which are the fact that you can't actually necessarily explain you can't use it as a predictive tool, and that's the fundamental difficulty there.
Yeah. The mic, we got
It seems that you've done the easy part of the process, which is to critique everybody else's perspectives on divine action. So if we accept your critiques, what's the constructive move to be made from here?
Well, I think, I mean, as you point out, it's always far easier to criticise other people's work than it is to actually put something together. I think the area that I personally feel is most promising is an emergence-based approach. Philip Clayton has written quite an interesting book on emergence, which certainly triggered a few sort of questions in my mind, as if perhaps that's the way to go in the future. Or a way to develop a theological model of divine action. But again, emergence is a very difficult concept, because it's not an easy thing to articulate either metaphysically or scientifically, and that makes it a very hand-waving kind of account. And there's nothing wrong with that, because ultimately we're talking about God's action in the world, which is something that it requires a certain amount of hand-waving anyway. But I think that's my sort of present view is that's the most promising approach at the moment.
Yeah, we'll take a couple here, then we'll go to Jana at the back.
Among the three approaches, the regularity, instrumentalist, and necessitarian, is there a dominant one currently in modern
necessitarian,
thinking?
I think is generally speaking the most dominant one, but it's a bit difficult to say. I think most practicing physicists, as it were, are deep down necessitarians, even if they don't admit to it. But you know, there is. I think that's by far the most widely accepted.
I appreciate your argument that special divine action can't be a violation of the law of nature, given the first two approaches to the laws of nature. It seems like if we give laws a conditional statement, such as whenever God isn't acting in a special way, then anus causes Venus, or something along those lines, then it seems like once again there isn't a difficulty. So I'm having trouble feeling gripped by the worry.
No, I mean, you can certainly you can certainly define your laws, as it were, in a way that permit the fundamental action, and that in a sense that just circumvents the entire debate, because if you do that, then why should we ever need to look at quantum theory? Why should we ever need to look at anything else? So, you know, and that's not that's a perfectly valid approach. It's just that once you get into quantum accounts of special divine action, you've already made these different metaphysical choices, and you're playing to a certain extent fast and loose with them, which is why I think that they're philosophically rather unsatisfactory approaches. So no, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that view.
Thank you. Good. So we'll go to the back.
I think when we take divine action, it will be good. And in the indeterminacy in the universe, I think if we divide subject in two parts, like first one miracles and second part as free will, I think it will be a benefit, because I think subject related to the miracles is, I think, is easier to handle than the subject of free will. For example, I think there are two levels for miracles, and one is subjective indeterminacy and objective indeterminacy in the universe. And many people think that, for example, Hume explained miracles as violating of natural laws, and many theologians like Schleiermacher that God cannot violate natural laws because natural laws are because of God's nature, and he cannot violate his own nature, for example. But if objective indeterminacy can be shown, so like something, connecting it with a butterfly effect, for example, that with small changes, God can make big changes in a part. I think it's very easy to explain miracles, many of the miracles, I think, according to me. But when we take in our hand the subject of free will, then the problem is not two parts, subjective and objective indeterminacy. I think there is some third point is coming into question, objectivity of the point of God. Sorry, indeterminacy of the point of God is important. Although there can exist objective indeterminacy in the world, it doesn't show that indeterminacy there is in the point of view of God. So I think the subject of free will is much difficult, and I think that by showing indeterminacy we can base all, I think, approximately miracles without violating natural laws. But I can think that we cannot handle by the free will subject as we can with miracles.
I have to confess, though, on both topics I find myself scratching my head. I'm really wondering where to go. But I think certainly in terms of divine action, it's possible to make a series of metaphysical choices which make it slightly more straightforward to as it were, explain than free will, essentially, not least because of the fact that there's an extra entity involved. God gives us the gift of free will, but then how do we actually express that as created beings? And there's another whole tier of complexity there. That said, a lot of the divine action debate really does owe a lot to the discussions about free will. I mean, one of the biggest problems with the idea that God is active in every single event is the problem of occasionalism, the idea that really nothing happens in the universe without God actually doing something, without God taking every single step. And occasionalism really found its expression in discussions about free will, because with the separation of the mind and the body, it was necessary for God effectively to step in and perform the acts that the mind was thinking. And the two arguments are very closely tied together, so there's a lot of common ground between them.
Thank you. John, yes.
Well, can I just make a comment? Thank you, Nick. I think your helpful analytical survey shows, how slippery and difficult this subject is. And it's pretty clear that either in terms of human agency or divine providence, no single causal joint, no single level in our way we survey the world is going to be the whole story. And that seems to be, that was what I was trying to say this morning. I think we'd be in agreement about that. I'd just like to make one comment about whole part causation. Because in your very interesting book, you awarded the small prize at the end of the discussion. I think it is an attractive notion, and I'm sure it's an intuition that has things behind it. But it doesn't. I don't think you can dispense with some attempt at causal analysis, and that's the attraction of whole part causation. Is it really finesses that? It just says somehow this happened. And I can make the point by reminding you again about confidence model. If the emergence of these amazing patterns of behavior looks like a holistic whole part causation, but because it's a totally deterministic logical model, we know all the causal structure is flowing up from the interconnection. So it's much more difficult to analyze, I think, than somewhat cloudy invocation of boundary conditions or whatever it actually does.
No, that's potentially why I find it perhaps a little bit more attractive. But
it's seductive, but
yes,
not expected.
it doesn't. No, in a way, it pushes the question one step on rather than facing it head on like the other approaches. But
yes.
You say, if I recall, that the under the regularity approach, an instrumentalist approach to laws of nature, then you couldn't really, by the way in which they're defined, have a violation of the law of nature. But under the necessitarian approach, you could. But I wonder if that's quite right, because even under even if you felt that the laws of nature were somehow necessarily held, a necessitarian could take the strategy of saying, on witnessing, say, water being changed into wine, or the waters of the Red Sea conveniently congealing, did you say? He could say, not that there's been a violation of existing laws of nature, but simply that there are further laws of nature, just as necessary as the previous ones, that we simply don't know about. In fact, that would be an extremely scientific attitude to take towards it, wouldn't it?
I mean, there are two different ways of doing it. You either say that the laws of nature are rather the necessary relationships are conditional on certain states being. So, for example, there's a law that operates in a normal way, except when wine does need to turn into water. So that's one way of doing it. The other way you can argue it is actually to say, well, there is another law which replaces this law at that particular point. I mean, the difficulty is that there's no reason, as it were, philosophically, not to build that kind of capacity into your philosophical approach to the way that the universe operates. But by doing that, you don't really need to be you've sort of taken the tenets of the necessitarian approach, and which is that things must have a necessary relation because of their ontological properties, and you're effectively sort of replacing that with a slightly modified version, which means that, well, that's true, but it doesn't actually require. It's nothing to do with the way that things are ontologically. It's just that we don't really know what the ontological status is, and that's a slight blurring of what we know as human beings. It's a sort of epistemological blurring of ontology.
It's what scientists do. Is it when they find odd things, they don't say
no, they think, how do we explain it? Yes.
There's an analogy actually here, rather like, I think it comes from Hume, and it perhaps slightly undermines his own case, about the Indian prince being told about ice or something, which is a phenomenon completely unfamiliar. And yet, I mean, actually...
well, yes, the Indian prince is an instrumentalist.
Well, quite. There would be a natural explanation, or you could be embraced within laws of nature.
Yeah.
Actually, I suspect Indian princes did know about ice. They probably had it brought down.
The princes
centuries ago.
Yes. All right. You haven't got one this side, yeah.
Hello, I would just like some clarification. Being a non-physicist, I might have completely misunderstood. Quantum theory, is it a problem of finding probabilities about things, or is it a problem that nature actually abhors an observational gap, which is where chaos theory would fit in?
Quite how you get to the indeterminacy in quantum theory is a matter of debate, because what we know about quantum theory is essentially two things. We know that mathematically, as systems evolve, they evolve in a way in which there are different potential states in tandem at the same time. This is the classic problem of Schrödinger's cat, which you may have heard of. This is where the cat is both dead and alive as far as the mathematical description of the cat's concerned. It's only when the lid of the box is opened that the cat's resolved into one state. Either he is alive or he is dead. And it's that the jump. It was von Neumann, I think it was, that postulated two different processes in quantum mechanics. So a fundamental process that happens at measurement, and an evolutionary process that happens to the wave function the rest of the time. And the question is, why should that chop, as it were, at measurement be an indeterministic selection? Well, there is nothing that forces you into that approach, although it is certainly something which is quite attractive for many reasons, just because it looks like a statistical approach. So there are accounts of quantum mechanics that purport to be totally deterministic. There's an account called the de Broglie-Bohm analysis, which is a deterministic way of looking at quantum theory, and so you're not forced into an indeterministic situation. It is, to a certain extent, because there is an explanatory gap, that it is possible to make this postulate of indeterminacy, but it is a postulate. There's no, at the end of the day, there is no. You're not forced into indeterminism.
So it's a metaphysical claim about the way things
absolutely,
are.
yes, yeah.
Paul.
Could I be allowed with a comment and a question? Both at a rather lower level than the previous discussion. The comment was about your illustration about crossing of the Red Sea. Some of us were fascinated by Colin Humphrey's presentation last week exactly about that. My comment would be that he regards it as an event which can be naturally explained, and to which both the accounts of Exodus 14 and Exodus 15 would apply. Wind put down is the technical term. Anyway, I found it a very, very illuminating.
No, that's not.
The question is quite different.
Yep.
You said there are difficulties raised by relativity about. I'm unaware of them. Could you explain?
Well, the difficulties are if you define divine action, or you approach the distinction. The distinction between special divine action and general divine action in terms of particular events happening at particular places at particular times, then those are concepts which, in relativity, are rather difficult to sustain, because you're not forced not to. I mean, there is a obviously events do happen at certain places and certain times, but it's the notion that where those events, that there is a an observer dependency to what you mean by. I mean, it's sort of inherent in your definition of special divine action as to where the observer is, because the observer is the person who's actually saying that, well, these things are happening at particular places and particular times. A different observer won't necessarily share that perspective.
I don't see the problem. I don't see why one observer can't.
Yes, I think John has thought about this.
I'll say something about it tomorrow, so
Okay, I think it goes back to block universes and all this kind of thing, which John has also critiqued and will do tomorrow. Okay.
I won't.
No.
I mean, let me just say that God is not a local observer. That's
No,
okay, God is not a local observer. That's what I said.
More questions? Yes, we've got one there.
And during our last talk, we looked at the mystery of prayer and the way grace and free will interact there. So I wonder if you could comment on prayer, given what you've talked about today.
Well, as I said before, I mean, because I've criticised some of the theological models, it doesn't mean that I've abandoned any concept of God acting in the world. What I think, my sort of approach is generally that you've got to test and try and bend those models as much as you possibly can. And so it doesn't mean that you should necessarily take them to that because we can't form an explanation that you've got to throw our hands up in despair. I'm sort of very much sort of reconcile with John's approach to prayer, essentially being as an opportunity for human beings to align themselves with God's intention to a certain extent, and that is a much easier thing to fit with a notion of special divine action than it is an idea that by wishing a certain thing, God will go off and do it next Tuesday. Because it may well be that the autonomous universe he's created doesn't give him the possibility of doing that, or someone's free will gets in the way. And those kind of concepts are riddled in this idea, a very strong idea of an intercessionary aspect of prayer. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's not worth praying, I certainly don't believe that at all, but it isn't the case that by wishing God to do something, he will then sort of chalk it up on his list of his checklist for next week. That's not the correct approach.
I'm still a little puzzled to know what moral we should draw. One moral, an extreme moral, which I think you don't want to draw, is that special divine action is impossible. You obviously don't want to draw that.
No, not at all, no.
On the other hand, you also want to say that the attempts to conform the notion of special divine action with contemporary science have failed.
They're
all
not,
of them.
Well, not that they've all failed. It's that I think that the most, in a way, the more specific the attempt, the more easy it is to, or the more there is to pick away at it in terms of failure or success. I don't necessarily regard it as failure or success, because I think, in a way, the way that the debate about quantum divine action has developed over the last 30 or 40 years after William Pollard first proposed it in the 60s has meant that we are actually far further towards actually really understanding what we're all talking about when we're talking about divine action in the world, and that's that is ultimately our task as sort of philosophical theologians to actually try and do that. I mean that's why we're sort of debating this stuff in the first place. I don't think it's not a question of total despair, and in a way the whole part approach, which John's not a great fan of, because it just moves the question on, and I quite accept that, and the approach using emergence are, you know, areas for sort of potential future thought on this. It doesn't mean that there is no possibility for divine action. It's not a moral discussion, it's essentially a philosophical one. And, you know, I draw quite a fundamental distinction between the two.
It almost seems, though, that the moral to be drawn here is, in a sense, rather a clearing away of the objection from Newtonian determinism. I mean, that contemporary science has undermined that kind of objection, and that's certainly the case, no question. The whole problem is whether it's done more than that. I mean, obviously that's a major achievement. I mean, there's no question about that. The whole question is, has it cleared the way in any positive sense? And John, of course, argues very strongly for that, but I take it you don't.
No, I mean, I don't. I think modern science teaches us a lot of things that we never knew about the universe, even very recently. I mean, the interconnectivity of the universe, the way that physical systems are so dependent on each other, the way that there is such complexity in the universe. Although underlying that, there may well be some amazing simplicity. I mean, it teaches a lot of themes, and these are themes which have theological consonance, certainly. I mean, you know, they're all common themes in theology. But, you know, that's not to say that there's, that science is effectively a tool with which to bash theological doctrine. It's I think the way that doctrine develops, it has to take account of what we know about science, and give it another 100 years, we may well say, oh, you know, do you remember all those people in the 21st century or 20th century arguing about chaos theory? I mean, it's that is the way that science develops, and, you know, we shouldn't be afraid of, I wouldn't say pinning our theology on it, but developing a theology which sort of embraces the same model changing in the way that science does. It's a different. You mustn't be too worried about not getting it right. I think that's.
Okay. Yep, we've got one at the back.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I'm going to come back to the fact that you said theology can influence or relate to sort of scientific approaches, especially to quantum mechanic approach, and perhaps has something to say about the many worlds theory.
Yep.
And you said it raises sort of theological questions like, can God sustain a totally good and evil universe or world? What do you think about that?
Well, it's. I mean, it depends which universe you're in, doesn't it? Really, but. I mean, the many worlds, many minds approach was, to a certain extent, hijacked, because it is in many ways rather more true to the mathematics of quantum theory than the idea of having a separate event at measurement. The original proponent of it was someone called Hugh Everett, who said, well, you know, why do we need necessarily this sort of fundamental interjection at measurement? And we've got superposed states. The different states could sustain different realities, and it was really that line of thinking that leads to an idea of having different worlds sustained in parallel. The question is, if you do end up with an absolutely vast number of worlds sustained in parallel, there will be worlds in which every measurement goes in different ways to the world that we are conscious of at the moment. And although it's kind of rather, as it were, cheap to assign a sort of notion of morality to that, it does mean that the free processes in the universe, to the extent they are, there will be two different extremes, and there will be moral worlds in which there are rather worse moral things happening, or rather, well, not necessarily moral, but rather worse things happening physically, or rather better things happening physically. And the question is, you know, how do you choose your way from amongst the different paths, and what does it mean if God is sustaining all of those together, and you know, what does it mean to have a few fortunate people that are in the very best world but can't, you know, that they're not aware of the very worst world, and that's although there's a sort of natural idea of heaven and hell and sustaining the two together, it isn't really like that, because you don't get to choose you don't get to switch between the different train tracks of the universes you're on. you're just stuck where you are. So there are some very lucky people out there and some extraordinarily unlucky people, and that's creates quite interesting sort of theological issues for, what does it mean to say that God actually sustains all of this lot together?
John does want to comment on that. Yes.
Thanks. I just want to make a couple of comments. One is, I said this morning that I think that causality is not a simply scientific question, and it is a metaphysical question, and that's illustrated by many of the things you said in your talk, Nick. And therefore, of course, it's perfectly proper in reaching a metaphysical conclusion to bring into consideration all sorts of other items that are not strictly scientific, and therefore there's no reason why theology shouldn't go put its money on a particular solution to the mental problem. That's an entirely reasonable thing for it to do. As far as many worlds is concerned, there's a sort of curious paradox about that, because first of all, it abolishes a notion of history, really, in a very strong sense, and I think that is a very great difficulty for most of the Abrahamic faiths, anyway, who have a very strong sense of history. The other thing is that if you really take it multiversally, so to speak, if you think about all this amazing portfolio of different worlds, if you are bold enough to talk about the wave function of the whole universe, which some people are, in those terms it becomes a deterministic theory again. You get this very much in Frank Piplow. So that on the most colossal scale, though what looks like contingency in the separate little components is in fact an overall necessity in this vast bets on everything development thing. So it's a curious paradox.
Essentially, we're all sitting on different trains. We can't control where they're going, but the route has been predetermined.
Perhaps as an aside to that, I think Murray Gell-Mann made the comment at one point that it would be good to play Russian roulette for very high stakes on the grounds that in some universe one would end up very rich.
That's a very good test of sincerity, I think.
Now, next question? Where are we heading? Where's the hand?
Indeterministic question.
Oh, I'll ask a question. One of the things about the quantum thing is that actually, I mean, if you just imagine a sequence of random numbers, for example, it's actually really quite difficult to make that sequence truly random. And if it were not so, there are various tests and so on that one could apply. Now, the parallel in quantum theory, given that events are probabilistic and that God is intervening in some kind of way, interacting in some kind of way, to juggle the statistics, I mean, in principle, I suppose that would be detectable, or is it just epistemologically so hard to do?
Well, the trouble is you need to know what you were detecting, and in order to detect it, you've got to, that raises an even more difficult question of what is it that God's up to. It's I think a rather difficult experiment to run, but it is that there's, I mean, the fundamental question about exactly, when you think of an indeterministic process, we naturally think of, your roulette wheel spinning or whatever. I mean, even though that isn't really indeterministic, it's what you colloquially think of as being indeterministic, and you can't quite imagine God juggling a roulette wheel, then picking up the ball and dropping it back into a particular slot. And I mean, that's just one of the problems with us being human beings. It's very difficult for us to sort of imagine that kind of stuff. But there are these fundamental difficulties, and they're rather more fundamental than that, because to a certain extent, the reason that we're forced into this whole discussion about divine action in a way that is consonant with science is because we talk about God's regularity, God's actually sustaining a set of reliable laws of nature, whatever the laws of nature are, and the fact the universe is not a capricious conjuring type of place, and that's the fundamental difficulty.
Of course, there's no such thing as a finite sequence of random numbers. So that's the problem, and the best way of trying to generate something like that is to use a quantum process.
Yes, and that gets
or not, as the guess.
Any further questions? Oh, looks like did you want to make any further comment? Do you want to? You want to say anything about the point Nick was making about energy and the sort of zero energy difference thing? It's a rather technical point, perhaps, but it's
a
seems
technical
very
point.
significant.
It's clear that I said this morning rather loosely that the different states in say a strange attractor don't differ in energy with a different pattern. Of course, you never get to that. You're absolutely right. That's an asymptotic statement. And at some stage, right, we're back in this business where all these particular focuses on particular levels or causal joints run out because you get engaged with the next one, so to speak. I mean, you get down to we're back to quantum chaology and all those sort of problems. And I mean, that it should induce in all of us a greater degree of modesty than was perhaps evident in the 1990s. But it also means that we don't understand the causal structure of the world. But that doesn't mean to say that we're hopeless about it. We have hints, we have things. Different people value different hints in different ways, exploit them in different ways. That's entirely legitimate and desirable thing to do. But we just have to be careful. We're back to this business that we can't establish these things, but equally the counter-arguments can't establish their rigid and exclusive position either.
Yeah, we have got a few minutes. We're aiming to finish by 12:30, so most probably like to.
If special divine action is taking place in a quantum indeterminacy level, what would the practicality of that would be in our lives? For example, I'm driving a car, I was just running into a wall, but I just stopped when there's an inch. Could I say, God, through the quantum indeterminacy, quantum indeterminacy, God have helped me? I mean, would that what any action in quantum level might have in our real lives?
This is one of the certainly one of the criticisms that a lot of people have said. Well, there are a heck of a lot of quantum events, and they are very small things, and you have to coordinate them in a very coherent, very large-scale way in order to actually get a macroscopic result. I mean, that's the that is one of the criticisms. The answer to that was something John mentioned a second ago, is this idea of quantum chaology. You have quantum events as the triggers to deterministic chaotic processes, so that just that one tiny flick of that switch will have a predictable consequence which God could have predicted. And so, there are counter arguments to each of these steps. Essentially, I mean, there's no. It is possible for certain quantum events to be far more significant than others, and whether you've stopped short of the wall or not may be due to the fact that a quantum event in the brake fluid in your car's brake system, and that could actually then determine the entire outcome of that physical process. So, it doesn't have you don't have to think of it necessarily in terms of enormous coordination between thousands and millions of quantum events. It could be that there are these highly significant individual events, and that's the answer to that essentially. I mean, the way that the proponents of quantum mechanical divine action, they say, well, we'll trigger off a chaotic process by a quantum event. It's the flap of the butterfly's wings.
Can I ask a naive question?
Yeah.
Why do physicists talk about probabilities rather than potentialities?
That's really, I think, a certain product of the fact that fundamentally people are necessitarians, because if you talk in terms of potentialities, you're often talking in terms of the universe having this flexibility within it, and that doesn't easily sit with a fundamentally deterministic approach. And most scientists, save for quantum mechanics, think of science in a deterministic way, because if you have an event, you want to try and explain it by reference to other laws or other events, and that is ultimately how science operates. And you can't just throw your hands up and say, well, it's an indeterministic event. That's my PhD thesis down the drain. It doesn't. Unfortunately, that doesn't work.